good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Mark Pillar. We're going to be starting our webinar with a Backendless overview for X parsers. Although it's not strictly for X parsers, it's for anyone who is starting to work with Backendless. I have already asked to get a confirmation on the sound. If something has changed, please send a chat message or post a question. I'll be checking questions periodically. Today, we're going to be focusing entirely on Backendless. It's going to be a technical presentation with a lot of walkthroughs and examples. I don't have any PowerPoints, so we'll just try to spend as much time as we can focusing on the actual product. We have quite a crowd here today. A lot of people have showed up. Thank you for your interest in Backendless. I do hope you will find this webinar useful. If there were any specific questions you wanted to ask while we have this sort of one-on-one contact, although the group is very large, please ask away. I'll try to spend a good amount of time answering questions in our webinar. Last week, we spent about 50 minutes just answering questions alone. So I'm pretty sure there will be some things that you would want to find out. If there are specific things you would want me to show from a demonstration perspective, please ask away. The earlier the better, just so I can prepare for that. There are some things I may not be able to show. What I'm planning on digging into today is we're going to talk about user service, configuration of the concept of Backendless user, how to set it up, how to create relations from user objects to various other data objects, user registration and login. We'll have a few samples to run from Xcode in Swift and also in Java for Android and plain Java if that would be your preference. Also, we will look into data service quite extensively, configuration of your data models, creating data objects, configuring them, validating them, using the APIs to save objects and update them in the persistent storage. We'll look into the file upload. I know there are a lot of questions from developers coming from Parse on how to relate data objects with files. It's one of the features that Parse has that we don't yet. So there is a workaround that I'd like to show you. And finally, we will look into push notifications. I'd like to give you a walkthrough on push notifications for iOS and Android. So that's my plan for today. I hope we will be able to accomplish all of it. Also, before we start, would like to give you an update on where we are as far as the bug fixes and the changes that we were working on. We are planning to release an update on our production servers either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow with a lot of changes, specifically focusing on the algorithm for importing data from Parse. We have made a lot of changes and improvements there. A lot of edge scenarios were taken care of. It's still not going to be the final version yet. There will be a few things that are left to be done. But as far as importing data, importing files, importing geopoints, users, roles, that should be taken care of. And if you have experienced any problems importing your data and you do have a zip file from Parse, please send that file to support@backendless.com so we can rerun our tests before we release that update to production. There is also going to be a bunch of various bug fixes related to social logins with Facebook and Twitter and many other bug fixes. There is about 50 bug fixes that I counted last time, which will be included in that release. There is a question on whether this webinar is being recorded. Yes, it is. If you need to leave before it's over, you will be able to catch the recording. It will be posted to our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and get started. What you see on my screen, let me see if I'm sharing it, yes, is a Backendless console, which is the front end for one's backend. And let's start digging into the actual user service. So user service is essentially a service with a set of APIs that enables you to work with users of your applications, or users of your applications can work with the backend through the user service. So there are many aspects to user service which are available on the users screen. and it starts with user properties. So user properties is a collection of properties that would be available in user object. So as far as the user object in your application, if you are programming in Objective-C, Swift, Android, Java, there is a built-in class in all our SDKs called Backendless user. It is not recommended to extend that class because there are various things that we do inside that map and marry that class to a special table located in the persistent storage that contains all your users. So, but before going there, let's talk about user properties. There are two properties that are required, and one of them is going to be used as identity. That's what users log in with, and there is also a password, and the password is always there and it's required. And when you can change your identity, so for instance, this is a brand new application that I created called Webinar app. By default, identity is set to email. If you want the identity to be name, so whenever users log in and you don't want them to enter a name, an email, but rather a name, just set the identity to name, and that's going to be done, right? So it's completely up to you. But there were a lot of questions coming from users on our support forum as far as customization of the user object. So customization can be done two ways. One is you can customize it using console, so you can add your own custom properties. So for instance, let's add a custom property called age, and we're going to set it as a numeric value. And at this point, there is a property called age. So whenever users register, they can provide that value in there. Alternatively, you don't have to do anything here in console at all. You can just drive user definition through the API. And in the API, there is a way to set custom properties on the user object. So anything you want, whether it's a primitive value or it's a pointer to some other object. And the pointer, we call them relations. So I know in parse, there is a relation and there is a pointer. In Backendless, there is just one concept, relations, and it could be declared as one-to-one, where one user may contain a reference to another one object, or one-to-many, where a single user object may contain a collection of other objects. So that would be one-to-many. So here I created a property called age, and then you can do various things here. So you can assign the default value, meaning that when a user registers, if they don't provide age, you can specify what the default value should be set as. You can set it as required, meaning that if someone registers and if they don't provide age, a value for age, and if it is marked as required, there is going to be an exception coming from the backend. So here you can control this. Or you can provide the validator for any of your properties. And then as far as the validator, there are some built-in validators, like if you want the age to be a number between 1 and 1000, all right? So here it is. Now the validator is set. Or you can do a custom validator, and in this case, you would just type in a regular expression that would be checked every time when the user is being registered or is updated. So this way you can do a lot of things here without writing any additional code, and the backend will facilitate all these rules for you. So for now, we're going to step outside of these user properties and take a look at how these users are organized in the persistent storage. I'm going to delete age just to keep things trivially simple, and click on data. And inside of data, the very first table, which will always be selected by default, the table called users. And if you're coming from parse, you'll be familiar with it. There is a table called users in parse as well. And in here right now, since it's a brand new app, the table is completely empty, but you can see all the properties which exist in this table. You will notice that there are a lot more columns here. Now, each column corresponds to a property, but there are a lot more columns in here than the properties that we just saw on the user screen. And it is for the reason that the users table is special, and there are a lot of system level properties. For instance, last login, which we always track and will contain values and when that user logged in last time. Social account, if user logs in with Facebook or Twitter or Google+, it will be indicated in this column as such. User status, whether it's enabled or disabled. Object ID is something that is assigned to every single object in Backendless. Owner ID, so as you can see, there are different columns here. If you don't like how busy that screen is for your application, you can control column visibility using this drop down. So here, if you don't care about updated, created, let's say owner ID, user status, or social account, then it just now fits everything. And you can also control the order of these columns. So if you want password to show up right after email, although passwords, we don't display them, but you can use it to change. Or if you want name to be right there, just change the order of these right here, and that's how it's going to be. These settings are going to be remembered for you on your client side in the browser. So next time you log in, you will see exactly the same layout of your tables. And it's not just the user table, it's all other tables in Backendless. Now, let's, since we saw how this works, let's go step outside of this into code and try to register a user using the API. And for this, I'm going to use Xcode, and I already have a little function here that registers a user. So here, the way this works, and if you're not familiar with Swift, but let's say you use Java, you will see that this is very similar. If there is a preference from anyone, if there are people who would like to see it in Java, please let me know. I'll switch to Android Studio and replicate exactly the same thing in Android so you can see it working there. But the concept is going to be absolutely identical. The way this works is whenever you need to register a user, create an instance of the Backendless user class. The Backendless user is part of the SDK, which is, in this case, my project is configured to use Backendless SDK, and I just followed the quick start guide as far as setting my environment up. It's fairly straightforward, and at this point, we haven't ironed out a lot of little wrinkles in the getting started guide that people stumbled upon. So it should be fairly straightforward. So you create an instance of Backendless user, and at the very minimum, you populate the email property of which is the email of the user we're registering and their password. And then with just a single call, Backendless user service registering, you pass in that user object. So this self.backendless, if you are in the Xcode in the iOS world, it is a singleton that is established this way. So see at the very top of my application, I create my Backendless variable, which is a reference to a singleton located inside of Backendless.shared instance. So once I make this call, that registers the user. Let me go ahead and run it. And while it's doing it, I'm going to check on the questions. Looks like we ran into an error. All right, so take a look. Notice that when I was messing with those properties, I apparently set the name property to be required, and as a result, my registration call is not going through. So to correct this, I will switch to my console, go and say that name is not required, and then we'll just rerun my application. So now it says user registered, and to see what I have in my persistent storage, here we go. There is user, it shows that there is one, and it shows that user right here. Notice that object ID was assigned, and now there is a unique object ID for that user. If I were to change the password for that user, all you need to do, I mean, as an administrator, you can just click on the cell, type in your new password, press enter, the password is going to be turned into a hash, salted, and so on, and stored in our persistent storage, and becomes immediately effective for that user. So they would just have to use new password to log into the application. So let's make something a little bit more complex. Let's add a custom property to a user in our program. For this, I'm going to modify the email because email is identity, so we're going to register another user. In fact, let's call him Joe. And the property that I'm going to create will be a complex type. For this, I do have a class called address, which contains nothing but street name and city. And in my code, I will create an instance of address and populate those two properties. Street name, let's say it's something like this, and the city is going to be Dallas. So now we have an instance of address. So the question is, how do you associate that address with the user which we are registering? This is very straightforward. All you need to do is use the set property method on the user object. and here we will call this property address, but it could be anything. We can just, let's just say my address, and the object will be the address that we created. Okay, that's it. So just adding these lines associates that user object with the user that you're registering. And let's rerun this application. Here it is, user registered. Let's take a look at how it is going to be reflected in the persistent storage. First of all, let's go back to users and notice that now in the properties there is a new property called my address, which is a relation to a table called address. And we didn't have to do this. Backendless took care of this for you. It created the table, created the relation, and let's see what the data looks like for the user Joe at Backendless. See, this is the new user Joe at Backendless. And it shows that for my address property, there is a reference to an object called address. And notice that there is now table called address, which we didn't create. It was created automatically. Inside of this table, if we were to click on this link, it will take us to that object that was created. And as you can see, city is Dallas, street name is exactly what I had in the code. So all these relationships were inferred from the data structure that I was passing into the registration method call. Now, whenever that user logs in, or we retrieve that user programmatically, there is a way to retrieve associated address, in this case, this specific object, into your client application. Or if it were a collection, you could just do it, retrieve all of them as a collection. I see there is a question. Let me take a look. Is there a way to automatically create a user without forcing them to enter password like in parse? I believe this is a question related to guest users. So guest users, which you create sort of like a ghost user that does not have specific identity, you can do it. You can just do it by creating a table that you can call guest users, and in there in the table store objects that are relevant to that user. So if someone is playing a game and they're not logged in, and you want to store some scores for that user, but later on when they register, you need to have all the information that you accumulated, that's not a problem. Create a table called guest user, start storing all the relevant information to that user in that table. Once they log in, you have all the data persisted that you can just copy from an existing object to the user object or create a relationship between them. Either way, this works. So I think that will work today without any additional changes. And I believe this is this fits into the general profile of how you work with persistence. The next question: in Android, to get the current user, do we need to log in the user on every activity, or does Backendless have some sort of token for future activities? Once you log in a user, a session is established, and in Backendless SDK, just like in SDK for iOS, whenever you log in a user token, which is essentially just a GUID, an ID, is returned back, and that user token represents the session. It is static for every subsequent API invocation which you can make inside of your application at this point. Those API requests are going to be associated with that user, so you will have it right there. To retrieve a reference to that user, there is an API in Backendless, and it is in the form of backendless.userservice.currentUser, and that will give you the user object. So there is a way to retrieve that user object in all other activities. You don't need to log in every time. Next question: do relations have properties like cascade delete and so on? I'll get to this once we start talking about persistence, but right now let's just focus on the user service. I know they are somewhat related, but it's more on the data service side of things. But I'll talk about it. Is there an installation class like in parts? Should we create it ourselves? It's more on the subject of push notifications, and it's going to be another topic that I'll be spending time on later today, but we will get to it. How is email verification done? As in parse, is it done by sending email to user? Excellent question. Let me show you how that works. So right now we register the user, and let me show you in the user object. There is a column user status. So right now the user status is enabled. You can change this behavior, so whenever user registers, they would have to confirm their email address before they can proceed. And this can be configured right here. When you go to click on users and then select registration, there is a property require email confirmation. If you turn this property on, then when user registers, they will not be able to log in until they click on the link sent to their email. And that would basically be email confirmation. And you can customize what that text of that email looks like. If you go to email templates, users, then email templates. And there are different templates here. One of them is user-made registration. This will be the subject of your email. You can customize it to whatever you want it to be. And in here, you just type in your text. There are some substitutes that you can use: application name, identity value, identity name. So by default, identity name is email, but if you change it to a different property, then identity name becomes the value of whatever your property is. So here you just type in whatever you want, and that's going to be the registration. The confirmation template. So this one I take it back. This one is just sent out to kind of thank them for registering with your application. To confirm an email address, it's the confirmation template right here, and this is going to be the URL that they will be clicking to confirm their email address. So this is the email that goes out if you enable require email confirmations. So hopefully that answers your question. All right, and I think these are all the questions that we have thus far. Let's move on. So now that we have a user that is registered and there is a property address, in order to retrieve that value, we log in, and that value will come back. As far as the values that come back, all the primitive values, meaning non-relations, will come back automatically. All the relations will come back if you were to load that relation or select auto load. So all the complex types that your user would have can be retrieved automatically at once if you select auto load. Selecting auto load is not recommended. It's not the best practice, because as your application becomes large, you may start slowing it down by including auto loads. The recommendation is to retrieve objects only as necessary whenever you need them, because keep in mind, you're building mobile applications. You want to load only as much data as you need at any point of time. All right, a couple more questions. Anything from mobile number verification by sending OTP number? Not out of the box. You can integrate third-party services for this and third-party APIs, but not out of the box as far as the mobile number verification. Is email for registration included with Backendless, so we need to configure an external provider such as MailChimp? It is included. However, it's going to come from our domain. All right. So as far as the email setup, if you click on Manage and select Email Settings, so these are the settings that are used by default. So anytime when a user registers and you want them to confirm email address, they will receive an email from develop@backendless.com. So for brand identity purposes, we recommend changing it to your own domain, to your own branded email. This way, the entire user experience of working with your application will have one continuous branding. And otherwise, you can keep it the way it is right now if you're okay with the fact that it's going to come from backendless.com. So that's how it works out of the box. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about, the user service. It is 125 and we still have data service and push notifications. So the data service, a lot of things that I'm going to talk about in data service, they are somewhat related to the user service because users are stored in the same persistent storage. So let's switch to data service, but if there are any questions as far as user service, we'll come back to that. So you already saw that there is a table called address that was created as a result of user registration. Tables can be created manually. There is an interface for this. Here, if you click on the plus button, and let's just create a table called order. And once you create a table, it asks you if you want to switch to schema editing. If you click yes, it prompts you to start creating tables. So let's just say this is going to be order name. So now we have created the column order name. And let's create another one called amount, which could be a double value. And you click save. So now we have two properties. So very similar to the way you would create properties for users, you can start creating tables and columns in your tables. So the screen that we're on is the Schema Editor screen. It is available if you're looking at any given table. If you click on this button right here, you're going to end up on the Schema Editor screen. In the Schema Editor screen, in addition to adding your columns, changing their names, or deleting columns with the delete button, you can also select the data type that you would want to assign to any given column. Once again, you can assign default value. You can assign constraints, and constraints apply additional logic. So for instance, if you're doing a lot of searches by order name, you might want to select the constraint to be, let's say, indexed, or you can make it a unique value or not null, depending on the logic that you have in your application. Similar to user properties, you can assign regular expressions to validate values that are being saved or updated for any given column. Or you can choose from a pre-configured regular expressions or pre-configured validators. Creating relationships between columns and between tables is also available right through this screen. So let's say we have a table called order, and we're going to create another table called order item. And here we're going to have item name as the property. And let's just say that the table order is going to have a collection of order items. To create this collection through Schema Editor, you click Add Column, and let's call it Items. And then here you select Data Object Relationship and select which table that relationship points to. And keep in mind that a single order may contain a collection of order items. That's why we select one-to-many for cardinality. Click Save, and now that establishes a relation between table order, which is right here, and table order item. And that column name is going to be items. It will contain a collection of order item. This is more or less kind of a schema-first approach, where you define your schema, and then based on that schema, you can write code or use code generator that will be created by Backendless for you. It's not the only approach that you can use to create your tables. You don't have to step into Backendless console at all. You can just start writing your code, persisting your objects, and all the schemas, tables, and columns will be created automatically for you. We don't have a preference how you do it, but it's completely up to you. So whatever really works for you, you can just use that approach. Let me just take a look. I see there are a few questions. Can you change the data type after data has been entered? What happens if existing data doesn't conform to the new data type? Excellent question. You can change data type after data has been entered, and it will work so long that a conversion is possible. If you have all the, let's say, string column, and you have some string values, and you're changing it to int, it will tell you that it cannot perform that change. But if conversion is possible, it will confirm it for you. Next question, how can we save array data types? The short answer is you cannot. We don't support array data types today. We have added it to our roadmap. However, since there is a workaround in Backendless, it's not the highest priority item for us. It's going to be done, and it's going to be done before parse is completely shut down. But it's not going to be done as one of the most important things. So I understand that some people built it. I'm not a big fan of that approach because I think it kind of violates some database principles. But that's irrelevant because people still build applications using that feature. So we will support it, but it's going to be done rather later than sooner. So, I'd estimate sometime this summer or sooner, we might have support for array data types. Okay, now going back to the schema definition. So here I created my columns. And then the question is, well, how can we enter data? You can enter data either through the API, or you can enter data in the console. So since we are in the console, let me show you how that will be done in console. So let's create an order item. And here we're going to create a new object, and let's call it iPhone. Okay, so now, and then another one, let's call it iPod, since we're in the I theme. All right, so now we have two items. And let's say in the order, we want to add order items to that order. So first of all, we're going to create an order, and let's call it gifts. So now you save this object first using console, and then you can add relationship to the item. So here in the items column, as you can see, the type of it is order item, it is relationship, and 3 red lines indicate that it is one-to-many. So this can contain multiple objects. If you click on the plus icon, it shows up a list of all the order item objects, and here you can select any number of them, or in this case I'm going to select both and click add related objects. So at this point my order includes relationship with 2 other order items. In fact, if I click on that link, it selects all the order items which that order is related to. Okay, oops, sorry about that. There you go. Just clicked on something here. So likewise, if you want to edit those relationships, you can click again, and you can deselect and click update relation. Or you can click and it will show you, if you have a lot of these here, if you click show only assigned objects, it will select only the objects that are currently assigned to that relation. Okay, so that's how you edit your relationships through console. You don't need to copy and paste object IDs like on Do It in Parse. It is all done through the visual interface. Searching your data inside of the console can be done using the search bar. In Backendless, searches work using an SQL-like query language. In fact, it is a subset of SQL. So here, if I want to find all the item names that start with IP, what you do is you type in the property name, item name, like, %, IP, %, quote. Okay, and if you select search, SQL search on, then this will be the query that you can actually use inside of your application, and it's a standard SQL in here that will give you all the objects that satisfy this particular query. These queries can be very complex, so you can add your and, ors, and in to create a subset and so on, or greater than, less than, and so on. All of these things can be included into your search query. And we call it where clause, because this is exactly what it is. Whenever you write an SQL query, anything that goes into the where part becomes that search condition. So that's how searches would work. And then once again, you can test it right here and then use it inside of your code to grab the actual data. Okay, so this is kind of a high-level overview of working with data. One thing that you will notice that I see a lot of people stumbling upon. Let's take a look at order. So order has a relationship called items. So this is a column items, which means in class order, you will be defining property called items. And the type of that property is going to be a collection of order item. Okay. If you were to click on order item, you will see that thing called child of. Okay, now this is indeed a visual column, but it's a virtual column. It's more of a visualization that says that this order item table, it contains children of another table called order. Okay, so going from order item to order would be possible, but that property is not defined in the order item. It's more of a visualization. So that's a very important thing to understand. Whenever you see child of, it's not a real property. It's more of a visualization to show you what parent object holds to that specific object. One other thing that I noticed, some people were getting confused on just the whole organization. The rows that you see here in these tables, so here there are 2 rows. Each row is a specific object, and the columns that you see are specific properties. So to map this to classes, columns are going to be fields or properties in your classes, and rows are going to be specific objects. So with all of that said, I'm going to switch to code and then show you exactly the same thing that we did, perhaps with different types, using the API. But before that, let me check. I see there are a few questions. There is a question on pricing, which we will talk about at the end. Please make sure to ask this question again once we go into the question and answer section of the webinar. Do you sell any data we may have in Backendless? Also, question not related to persistence, but I'll be happy to talk about it at the end of the webinar. What is the recommended approach for many-to-many relationships? The recommended approach is to use many-to-many relationship is essentially one-to-many going both ways. So if you have table A, and then you have which contains a collection of table B, and then you have another one going from table B to table A, in other words, single object of B contains multiple of object A. What you can do is you can define two relationships, one-to-many on both sides of it. So in the traditional database design, you would create a third table that contains the actual mapping. In Backendless, you define two columns, one in table A and the other in table B, and they point essentially at the opposite tables. So that's how you would do it. In all the applications that I have seen built in Backendless, there is always a way to simplify it without the necessity for many-to-many. But with the approach that I described, it generally works. Any constraint on the next question, any constraint on the number of tables? So in Backendless, there is a free tier that has limitations, and you can overcome those tiers by buying additional function packs. As far as the number of tables, the free tier includes 200 tables. You can buy an additional block of 100, I believe, for $5 a month. So you can extend it to really any number of tables that you want. Granted that additional tables will cost you more money. There's a question, do you use MongoDB behind the scenes? Yes, we do, although in the spirit of MBAS, Mobile Backend as a Service, the backend implementation is really a black box, so it is really irrelevant what we use, as long as we provide service that is fast and scalable. And as far as Backendless, it is fast and scalable. There is another question, is there equivalence to cloud code? Yes, there is. I'll talk about it right after I'll show you the API, because there is a tie-in from cloud code to all the persistence supported by Backendless. All right, let's switch to the code. In fact, before we go there, I'm gonna do some cleanup and let's say remove these order all the tables here, so we start completely with a clean persistence. In fact, remember that users had a reference to address. You can actually delete the entire address table, and users will be adjusted accordingly. So now the relationship to address is completely gone if you needed to do that. All right, let me show you an example in Swift first. So here we're going to comment out that register user. I do have another function here called save person. So here it is. Let's take a look at the classes first. So first of all, there's a class called person, and that class contains name, bio, and a collection of addresses. So you see the property addresses is a collection of address objects. And a single address object, we already used it, contains a street name and city. So this is a typical one-to-many relationship. And from the API perspective, what we do is we create an instance of person. And as far as the class definition, it is as simple as just a super simple class. It derives from NS object. So there is nothing specific to Backendless here. You don't need to extend our classes, implement our interfaces. It's a pure Swift class. And so we created an instance of person, put the name here. Then we create two instances of address objects. There is an address in New York, and there is an address in Chicago. And we add those address objects to the collection of addresses sitting inside of person. So this is for address 1, this is for address 2. Okay, and then to save that person object in Backendless, this is the line of code that you will see related to Backendless. The way it works is you say backendless.data.auth, and you specify the name of the class which you will be saving. The name of the class will correspond to the table that will contain objects of that class. since we are saving an instance of person, then which is this guy right here, it is natural to say that instances of person need to sit in a table called person. And in this case, we obtain with this of a reference to something that is called data store, which is an abstraction that gives you complete CRUD, create, retrieve, update, delete interface to work with anything stored in that table. So backendless.data.of, then the class name, will give you all those methods to work with it. And in this case, it's going to be table method save, but if you look inside of what's returned from off, it's going to be find, create, update, load relations, a bunch of other methods that will give you an ability to work with that. So let me call save person from the main function here and run that method. All right, so person object has been saved. And let's take a look at what it looks like in Backendless. Refresh using this button. So now here it created table person. As you can see, all the properties are there as far as the name, and there is a collection to addresses. And here, as you can see, it is a reference to the address table with 3 lines, one-to-many relationship. We do have 2 objects in address, and to see what they are, specifically as far as the ones related to that person, click on that link, and here it is. So all the properties we have defined in code are available right here. So the whole thing was created naturally and without any human intervention. One thing that I forgot to mention is if you were to create it manually, the way I showed it with order and order item, or at any point of time whenever you have those tables, there is a way in Backendless to generate all the client-side code that will allow you to work with these tables. So in other words, all the code for specific classes defining person, address, and so on can be generated for you. And to do this, if you click on the code generation icon, here select your platform, let's say Android. I like IDEA, so I select IDEA, and then I say, give me everything for Java classes for defined data tables, meaning all the data tables that I have in here, I want Backendless to generate code for those tables for me. So I select this guy, click download project, and the code that is downloaded, show you what's inside of it. And in here, you will see that there are classes. In this case, Java classes. As you can see, address and person, they have been generated for me. So as far as address, just something simple. So this is the generated code for address. As you can see, it contains all those, in this case Java, getters and setters for all properties which were found in table address. So this is super simple because if you go with the schema first approach, once you define your schema, you can get all the classes that you can start using in your application with just a click of a button. And then relations are also accounted for. In fact, if I open person, then you will see that person contains a collection of addresses as well as the methods to work with those addresses. So you can get address, set address, and so on. Plus all the functions to actually save, load, remove, and so on an instance of person class. So this is a very, very convenient way to start working with Backendless very quickly with writing minimal amount of supporting code. The same thing is true for iOS. So you select iOS and you can select all the classes. Right now, it is just Objective-C. We're adding support for Swift. So if you are developing in Objective-C, you can get started using this approach very quickly. Okay, we are very quickly running out of time. There is 15 minutes left. So with this, I'm going to be switching to push notifications because that's also something that a lot of people have asked about, and I can see how it could get very complicated, but I'd love to demonstrate this for you. Let me take a look at the questions first. Okay, please show an example in Android Studio as well. I assume this is for the relation. No problem, I'll do that for you. Is there anything like local data store? Not right now. It's something that we are working on. It will be added. In the meantime, there are some third-party libraries and frameworks that will allow you to do local persistence. So as you load objects from Backendless, since those are pure Java or Swift classes without any dependencies, persisting them locally is fairly straightforward. So you can just use any solution off the shelf that will give you local persistence. We will make it simpler, but in the meantime, there is a way to do this. There is a question. I noticed you set object ID in the person class. Do you have to do that, or Backendless will automatically add an object ID if you don't? Fantastic question. So here, if we take a look at our code in Xcode, in the person class there is indeed object ID. If I remove it, nothing will change. It will work exactly the same way. In fact, there is a special logic in our SDKs that will sort of store kind of a phantom copy of your object with all the properties that you didn't declare, and they'll keep them in a shadow copy. So whenever you're flushing, let's say you loaded this person, modified it, and then doing an update. And without an object ID defined in there, update's going to be hard to do. In fact, it will fail. But we have additional logic that is in there that stores that object ID. So if you don't declare one, things will work exactly the same way. You don't have to declare it if you're not using it in your application, and things will work just fine. Okay. Is this webinar recorded? Yes, it is. You will be able to see it in our YouTube channel. How can I add a new column to an existing table that contains data? No problem. Let me show you how you would do this. If you go to data and you select any given table, click on table, schema, and permission. In fact, let me switch to address. So click table, schema, and permission, and then click add column. So let's just call it state. Click save. Now there is a column state. So this is how you do it in console. If you were to do it from the API, just add an additional property to your class definition, save an object with that property, or an update an existing one, and that column will show up automatically. So either way, either do it in console, and it will be there, but you will have to update the code anyway. So you might as well just update the code and drive it from there. Okay. Looking for some additional questions that were here. Can you talk about media streaming? Sorry, not today. There is still a lot to discuss, and media streaming could be a subject to talk about in a completely separate webinar dedicated to media streaming. Does Backendless have equivalent methods for save eventually or save in background? So for every single API that we provide, there is a synchronous version of the method, and there is an asynchronous version of the method. Of course, the difference between the two is that the asynchronous doesn't wait for the response. So your program will continue to execute, and then when the response or failure is available, it will be delivered to you either through, let's say, responder object, which is available in Java and iOS, or block-based callbacks, which are available in iOS. So, and that's more of an equivalent of save and background. Save eventually is not supported right now for the reason that there is no really concept of offline work. So save eventually works well when the application is aware whether it has network connectivity or not, and there is logic for retries. As we're adding support for local storage and the offline support, it will become available eventually. But as of right now, that support is not there. All right, let me quickly show you persistence from Android, and then I'll switch to push notifications. So as far as Android, I'm going to create a brand new project. So let's say that we're going to have a class. Let's go with the same order and order item that I have shown to you previously. So let's create a class order. And here in Java, you can either go with public fields or getters and setters, or a combination of those. So for the brevity, I'm just going to use public fields. Each class must be defined in its own file. And by the way, that's very important for those who build in Xcode. Every class that you define, it must be in a separate file, because if you define classes within your controllers, then that will not work. Another class I'm going to define is order item. And here it's going to be public string item name, and inside of the order there's going to be a collection of order items. Public array list order item. Okay, now in my code I'm going to create an instance of order item. And another order item. Okay, and now we're going to create our order. Order items is going to be initialized. And we will add order items to our collection. And to save this, we say backendless.data.of. The class is going to be order save order. Okay, let me double check that I have the right application ID. Speaking of application IDs, whenever you start with an application, if you go to Manage App Settings, you need to get your application ID, which is this guy right here, and it looks like that's what I have. So it's very important in that when you start building your application to call backendless.init app, it needs to be done only once throughout your application, somewhere early on when you start your app. So here, let me run this app. And of course, here it's going to take a little bit longer, but it's already ready. Launch the emulator. And while it's starting, I see there is a question. Can we run backendless.init app from .application file? I'm not familiar what .application file is. You run it from, if it is an Android application, you run it, unlock it right here. In my case, I run it from my main activity. So that's where you're going to put it, is you're just going to run it in your main activity. The error we received is very common. You see it says internal client error. And the reason it occurs is because we invoked a synchronous method, which is safe without any callbacks, and the main UI thread in Android. Android does not like it. It does not allow any network communication on the main UI thread. And this error occurs quite frequently whenever someone starts working with Backendless. To work around this problem, you can either create a new thread and invoke any kind of API that you use with Backendless in that thread, or use the asynchronous version of the API. The asynchronous version of the API will have exactly the same signature, where the last argument is going to be an instance of async callback. So your code will look something like this. So as you can see, we added async callback, and for instance, IntelliJ, the code will be automatically generated for you. In fact, let me show you how that would be done. So if I remove it and then I say new async callback, it automatically generates it for you. And I already had one made with some logging messages in there. So right here, just put the comma. So this code is good. And the way this works is whenever you invoke it asynchronously, the execution of your program will continue. It will save the order. Whenever a response comes back from the server, the handle response method will be invoked. If server returns an error, then the handle fault will be invoked. In the successful invocation, the argument is going to be the order object, which is the saved object. It's going to be exactly this guy right here, but with object ID assigned to it. So this is going to be an invocation of the, this is going to be an object that is already saved. So now whenever this occurs, it is always a good idea to restart your emulator. Here in the emulator, in fact, we saw that error. Let me quit it and rerun this application. So we're going to launch a new one. So now we rerun it, and as you can see, order is now saved. And now if we go back to Backendless console, and here refresh the table, we'll see now there are two orders. One was created in iOS, and the second one was created in Java. So this shows that exactly the same approach works in both languages. I see there is a question whether Backendless supports cloud code. So with cloud code, we call it business logic. And with business logic, if you go in your console and select business logic, there are different categories here. So the cloud code that you are familiar with parse, the equivalent of that would be under service event handlers and code blocks, timers. So service event handlers are is going to be as close as you get to code block. Although with code blocks that you have with parse, you have a fairly limited set of events that you can attach your code to. Specifically, data events related to persistence of your data objects. With Backendless, every single API that we support can be extended with custom business logic. So for example, if you want to attach business logic when a file is being uploaded, or a geolocation search is running, or a media stream is starting, or a user is registering or changing password, you can do that. So here you select, first of all, the service that you want to extend. You select the language in which the cloud code is going to be written. And right now we support Java and PHP. We are adding support for Node.js. So in Java, you say add event handler. You select which event you want to customize. And then these events correspond to APIs that we have. So let's say user registering is going to be this event. And you can specify whether it's going to be the before or after. And before meaning before core business logic, and after it's going to be after default business logic. By the way, my push notifications just started working. We'll get back to that. So here, once you select the event and the call timing, click save, it generates, in this case, Java code for you, okay? And it tells you where you need to add your code. So you can generate as many event handlers as you want. Click download, it will give you a full-blown project with all of the code that is generated. You can add your own code in there, debug it on your own computer, then deploy it to the cloud. That's, once again, can be done in Java or PHP. As far as background jobs, the term that we use are timers. Here you can add your own timer and give it a name and specify when it needs to run, whether, like weekly, every 2 weeks on Sunday and Thursday, or if you want it monthly, select the months when it needs to run, which dates, or first Monday of these months, or if you want it to run in a custom, and you can say run it every, 300 seconds, no problem. You click save, it generates the code for the timer, and it says, well, add your code right here. Okay, once again, a download, add your code, and that's going to be your custom business logic. All right, next question. Stability of Backendless. If you could rephrase your question as a question, I'll be happy to talk about stability. What do you mean? Financial stability, technical stability? I'll be happy to talk about it, but please tell me exactly what you would like to know. Do you sell any data we have in Backendless? No, we do not. All the data that is in Backendless belongs to you, and that's your data. So we don't have any ethical right or any right whatsoever to actually sell it. So the answer is we do not. Will cloud code eventually support JavaScript? Yes, it will support JavaScript. We hope as early as March of this year. So we are nearing the development freeze for all the changes, and we will be providing support for that through our website and one of the future updates, which is going to be fairly soon. So all the changes that we have done, we're quite happy with them, and it's a nice piece of work. What is the uptime guarantee of Backendless? Well, right now for cloud version of Backendless, there is no SLA. Of course, it's our goal to keep it up 100% of the time. However, there is no uptime guarantee. There is uptime guarantee for managed Backendless, and that one has the guaranteed SLA. I believe it is 99.1%. But for cloud version of Backendless, we reserve the right where we need to, for whatever reason, perform updates and so on. We haven't. The last time we had any downtime, which was about, I believe, like 90 seconds, it was close about 5 months ago. But so it's generally very stable, and we have a very good history of uptime. The product is quite mature. We started 4 years ago, and we have gone through a lot of iterations. So at this point, we're very confident with the stability of Backendless. In highly regulated industries such as banking, etc., the data needs to be encrypted and stored in the US. Is there an enterprise version of Backendless? Yes, there is, and it's called standalone Backendless, which you can run on your own servers, in the cloud, in your data center, whatever, or managed Backendless, which we run for you. It is going to be in the data center that you would want in the US, in Europe, and Asia. We have multiple data centers available at our disposal, and we have gone through several certifications, and with all the requirements for encryption and so on, we can satisfy those. So both standalone and managed would provide you, would be able to match those requirements. Well, what do you use for push notifications in Android? Can we use a custom receiver? Yes, you can. So there is a built-in receiver that we provide, and it's in the documentation. You can customize it by extending it and have your own broadcast receiver. All right, how much Backendless is stable as sparse shutdown with just one notice? I hope you survive for many coming years. Yes, I hope that we survive in many coming years as well. How stable are we? Well, the more of you are willing to pay for our service, the more stable we're going to be. With everyone hoping to get a lot of things for free, where that doesn't generate revenue, does not help our stability. So I would love to turn this around and say, well, if you're willing to pay for function packs or managed Backendless or whatever, that will certainly help our stability. Okay, if there are any additional questions, I'll be happy to answer. But if not, then we'll be stopping the moment now. Thank you, guys, and I hope to see you soon. The next webinar will definitely dedicate to our push notifications.